Hello, everyone. I hope that you had a great weekend. My name is Christine, and I'm the student assistant for the SURE program this summer. This is a SURE event, and our event today is planning and organizing your literature review with Jill McMillan. So, what is SURE? SURE is a co-curricular record program for USask undergraduate students in any discipline who are conducting course-based and faculty-led research projects or co-op internships, or who are interested in doing research in the future. We facilitate research opportunities, training, events, and offer co-curricular credit. SURE helps undergraduate researchers make important connections, build professional relationships, and allows students to share their research in the annual SURE Summer Symposium. We focus on three areas: communications, professional development and entrepreneurship, and research management, ethics, and technical skills. So just a few housekeeping. First off, let's just keep our mics off. If you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A box, and Ren will be monitoring that chat, or you can also ask us at the end of the presentation. Our speaker today is Jill McMillan. Jill is a learning specialist at the university library focusing on graduate writing support. She also teaches a non-credit course for international graduate students. She joined USask in August 2019 after previously working at two Ontario universities in similar roles. Before moving into the post-secondary field, she worked as a high school teacher in Canada and overseas. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So I have a lot to share today, so I'm going to go at a fairly quick pace, but I recognize how boring that can be if I'm just talking for an hour straight. So there are different opportunities during the presentation today to contribute via the chat, and I have sort of indicated little time frames for that. So I encourage you, when we have those opportunities, to please engage in the chat. And then if you have questions, just as the presentation is going, do make use of that chat. I have that screen open at the same time as I have the slides, so I'll keep an eye on any questions that might pop up. Depending on the nature of the question, I might save it to the end of the presentation to address. But sometimes if it's looking for a little bit of clarification, I can pause and provide a little bit more explanation. All right, so this is the first part of a two-parter series on literature reviews, one of these texts that, one of these genres that are so commonplace in academia, regardless of one's field. And our focus today is really on, um, ensuring that we're really familiar with the purpose of this type of text and some of the practical things that we can do when we're preparing to write our literature review. So let's not delay, let's jump right in. So this is our overview for today's session. We are going to talk a little bit about how we can conceptualize the literature review, and then we're going to focus on engaging with and organizing our sources, because this is what is foundational to the review. What questions we can ask when reading other the work of other scholars, different sources, keeping track of what we have read, and then starting to think about how we might organize our literature review, focusing on some pre-writing strategies that we can make use of to take on this type of text. All right, so my first question, and you can just put familiar or unfamiliar into the chat. How familiar are you with this concept of the academic conversation? Is this a phrase that you've heard of before? Have you heard it in relation to literature reviews before? Is this something that you've encountered, or is it completely new to you? So just take a minute and pop into the chat whether you're familiar or unfamiliar with this concept. Okay, so we're getting some responses popping in, and the trend seems to be that this phrasing, the academic conversation, is somewhat unfamiliar to folks, and that's fine because that's why we're talking about it. Um, the academic conversation is really a way of conceptualizing how research develops and how researchers on their own projects, their own papers, are gradually adding to our shared knowledge. So you can think of it in terms of actually having a conversation, two people having a conversation, two groups having a conversation, many groups having a conversation, many scholars having a conversation. And so we're asking, how are scholars engaging with a specific topic that they are investigating, that they're researching? Where do we see agreement or disagreement among scholars? So depending on the topic, you might have a lot of scholars who are saying, oh, we should approach it from this perspective. Other scholars are saying, no, we should approach it from this perspective. So where is that level of agreement or disagreement when reading all of the literature? What is adding to our understanding? So basically, how is the research that we are looking at, how is that helping to move knowledge forward in a specific field? And then how do we join? How do we join this conversation? So everyone is, all of these academics, all of these scholars are chatting, are conversing, are communicating about a particular topic, but where do we fit? And we actually have two ways in which we can join that conversation. We can think of the analysis that we contribute. So when we are reading the work that other people have produced, we are bringing our own analysis, our own interpretation to that reading, and we can surface that and add analysis. Or it might be that we are working on a research project that is going to advance knowledge in some way. So really, the academic conversation, it's about how we are sort of working together as a research community all around the world, across time periods as well, because you can go and look at sources from 100 years ago or more, and figuring out how do we know what we know? How do we ensure that we are moving knowledge forward? So the reason I start with this kind of question and this kind of conceptualization is because in some ways this is one of the best ways for really interrogating the purpose of a literature review. So when we are looking at all of this literature. Oh, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Just let me pause for a second.
Hi, Jill, you're muted on Zoom if you're
Yes, I had a bit of a technical issue, but I think I have solved it. I apologize for that interruption. Okay. All right. So when we are looking at all of this research, we still come up against these unanswered questions, right? And as frustrating as it might be not to have those answers, these actually present as opportunities. These gaps of knowledge create space. It creates space for our own thoughts, our own research, as well as creating space for other people's thoughts and research. So this is something that we always want to be mindful of when we are reading all of the literature that we've pulled together for our literature review. So the literature review can be interpreted as a snapshot of that broad academic conversation. In short, it's trying to achieve two things: what is currently known and what remains unknown. That's basically the purpose of a literature review. What do we know, or what is accepted knowledge, and where do these gaps of knowledge remain? And so it's providing a nice overview of the current state of knowledge. And depending on how you're using a literature review, it might also be providing context for new research. So if you're attaching this literature review to a research project, for instance, it's really helping to create the argumentation for the research project in the first place. In terms of the conventions of a literature review, one of a very firm convention is this strong emphasis on synthesis. And synthesis is something that will feature a lot in part 2 of this series. So next week I'll be talking about this at length. All right, so when we're thinking about the review, it really is this interdependent process. In other words, you're having to juggle a lot of different things at once. You have your research, you have your analysis, you have your writing, and there's a lot of overlap among these different areas, because as you're writing, you might find out, oh no, there's an area where I don't have sufficient research, I have to go back, I have to get more papers. As you're analyzing those papers, you might realize, oh, I actually have to go get this other paper that didn't come up in my initial search, and so on and so forth. So let's just assume, though, that, oh, and just looking ahead at part 2, again, is going to be focused a little bit more on the writing. But let's use our imaginations for a moment, and let's assume that you have the majority of the sources that you're going to use for your literature review. So you've done a ton of work in terms of pulling together all of these papers, all of these texts that are going to be the basis of this text. So the question that might emerge is, well, now what? I have all of these papers, what am I supposed to do? So you need to ask yourself, how are you going to engage with them? And importantly, how will you keep track of them? Because once you have more than 10 sources, it starts getting very easy to fall into a state of disorganization. So let's talk about engagement first. Engagement comes down to questioning in this context. So you want to really ask yourself, what are the kind of questions I might ask when reading academic sources? What kind of perspectives am I bringing? So let's take 3 or 4 minutes and actually contribute in the chat the different questions you ask when reading academic sources. Okay, I just want to go through some of the questions that have already been shared. And these are really fantastic questions. So how old is the information? And it might be, depending on the nature of the information, even maybe it's 50 years old, but maybe it's still relevant. Maybe it is still considered acceptable knowledge. Other, it might be considered quite out of date. So you really want to be mindful of what is considered timely and up-to-date information in your field. And this is going to be very different depending on your field. But you want to ask yourself, am I finding the most timely, the most relevant sources? What was the objective of the text? Have the authors actually fulfilled this objective? Is there that sense of agreement? Do other authors agree with the information that was discovered? What sort of limitations are in place? And there's so many limitations on research, right? There's not really a perfect research study. And then how could this be applied in different contexts? So if this is something that is based on information in a lab or on a very specific type of population, can that be transferable to other contexts, for instance? So these are really, really great questions to ask. And in asking these sort of targeted questions, we demonstrate our analysis and we're able to weigh the sources in relation to each other. So if we determine that one source is more trustworthy or is more relevant than the other, that might dictate how much focus we give it when actually writing our literature review. So I have lots of questions I'm going to go through at a fairly rapid pace. I don't expect you to remember all of these questions, but what I want you to be mindful of is the fact that you really should be in this habit of asking these very pointed, targeted questions when reading any academic sources. So you're going to see a little bit of overlap with some of the questions that were already surfaced by you in the chat. But we can think of in terms of purpose. So what sort of problem has been identified? Why is this research being done in the first place? What argument has been developed? Is there any sort of value? What kind of knowledge is this source contributing? And what about the sources that text or that study has drawn on? So actually going and looking at the information that they've drawn on to put together their research project, for instance, that is going to be very useful knowledge to have to determine whether or not they're basing their argument on uninformed foundation. And then depending on the nature of the source that you're looking at, if you're looking at a sort of conventional journal article in the social sciences, in STEM subjects, you're likely going to have these very specific sections like methodology, results, discussion. And each of those sections, you want to ask yourself different questions. So thinking about the methodology, going back to that notion of population, or who or what was studied, how was this rationalized, what kind of tools or tests were used, why, always asking the justifications that were provided. What's the type of data that was collected, why this data over other types of data? Was the method that was used actually appropriate for the research question or the topic that was being explored? Because certain methods might not actually be the best fit. So again, looking for the justification, looking for those gaps that the researchers might have overlooked. Looking at results and data, any surprises, anything that you find surprising or that the researchers found surprising. Are the results generalizable? Is there sufficient data for the nature of the topic? Because some topics you don't need that many data points. For other topics, you need lots and lots of data points. So is it sufficient for the context? How is this data presented? And then the discussion. How have the researchers interpreted this data? Do you have a different interpretation? Do you identify strengths or limitations of the interpretation that the researchers are presenting? Are they relying on any sort of logical fallacies when interpreting the results? So really, again, interrogating everything that has been presented in the source. And then you can ask additional questions. So overall, what would you identify as the strengths, weaknesses, or limitations of the particular study or text that you're looking at? How does it relate to other sources, other studies? What sort of assumptions are present? Are they justified? What might be some of those practical implications? And so that relates directly back to Christine's question in the chat. What should be done moving forward? And if you want to be really cynical, who funded the research, right? So you always want to be mindful who is providing the money. And this has to be disclosed or typically this is disclosed in reputable journals. So here we have an original research article all about the benefits of doll play, using neuroscience to examine the benefits of doll play. So interesting topic. Let's see who funded it or provided some of that funding. The funding for this project was provided by Mattel in partnership with Oxy Insight Limited. Are you familiar with Mattel? Does this ring a bell? Is this a familiar name to you? Do you have a sense of why? Yep. So Christine immediately said Barbies. So Mattel is the manufacturer of Barbie. So obviously there is some investment that goes beyond money into a study like this. So even though the researchers are able to operate independently based on the disclosure in the funding statement, you do have to, perhaps be mindful of this when reporting on a study like this, because Mattel certainly wanted to advertise the results of this study. So you always just want to ask yourself, okay, who is actually benefiting from these results being published or publicized? So it's just one of those elements to be mindful of when looking at any research. And a lot of academic research, a lot of the funding disclosure, there's nothing to disclose because they haven't actually received any funding, external funding. But there are instances where they do, and so you just want to be a little bit more mindful in those instances to ensure that that is something that might have to be surfaced in the literature review if it's relevant. Now, one of the things I really want you to be mindful of when looking at all of the scholarship that you've assembled for your literature review is to be aware that you have and should, you have permission to and should critique this literature. I alluded to this earlier. Perfect studies, so-called perfect studies, are very rare if they exist at all, because there's so many different ways in which a question could be examined. And so this notion of a perfect study is a bit of a fool's errand. And the reality is that researchers have so many constraints. They have so many things that are restricting them when it comes to research design. Maybe they don't have a lot of money. Maybe they have a lot of time pressures that they have to be mindful of. So it might be that everyone wants to do a longitudinal study, but that's a huge time investment, right? Maybe someone is 5 years away from retirement. It's difficult at that point to launch a longitudinal study that's projected to be 30 years. So you'd have to have, questions of succession built in, all of this kind of stuff. And of course, there are ethical considerations that we have to be mindful of. So when it comes to just some basic biases, this might be a bit of a refresher for you. This is covered in a lot of, intro to research methods courses, but I think it's good to have a refresher now and then. You have researcher biases, we have participant biases, we have confirmation biases, we have measurement biases, we have sampling biases. So depending on your field, you might be familiar with this acronym WEIRD, Western Educated Industrialized. Oh, I always forget what the R and the D stand for. But basically, it's reflecting the fact that a lot of social science research, especially, draws on populations like university students. And university students don't tend to reflect the global population very well. So they're always just things that we need to be mindful of that then gives us more permission, I think, to critique these other scholars. Because so much of what we rely on in academia is the power of peer review in order to keep people in check and to ensure that the knowledge that's being published and promoted is actually trustworthy. So another question for you. Are you familiar with the concept of retractions? Retractions in academic publishing. Okay, so I'm seeing some no's pop up. And so retractions basically are a means of almost like quality control after the fact. So when a paper is, or an academic monograph is going through the process to get published, it's going through peer review, it's going through that process to try and ensure that what is going to be published is trustworthy, is appropriate, is meaningful in some way. But sometimes that process is not enough to ensure that what is being released is actually of good quality. And so the basis of a retraction is basically, it's sort of, it's like a little bit of a warning almost. And retractions exist in sort of two areas. So you have self-retraction and editorial retraction. So self-retraction would be an instance where the researcher has gone back after their article has been published and they realize they've made a mistake. They've made a mistake, and rather than relying on someone else to surface that, they communicate with the editors and say, we need to remove this, we need to retract this article because of this error. In other instances, you might have what's known as more of an editorial retraction, and this is where someone other than the researcher has said, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this text. And so the article is pulled or it's labeled as retracted because of errors, fraud, misconduct, issues with authorship. So it is this sort of final means to try and take poor research out of circulation. So if you are researching and you come across an article that has a big retracted label on it, that's an indication that this is not really a trustworthy piece of research anymore. And there will be a retraction notice so that explains why it has been retracted in the first place. And if you're really become interested in this, you can actually, and especially if you're someone in the STEM subjects, there is a really interesting website called Retraction Watch. So just retractionwatch.com. And they basically try and stay on top of all the different retractions that have emerged in order to, again, help ensure that a certain quality assurance remains in place. And now the reason why I'm going on and on about retractions is, again, just to remind ourselves that just because something has been published in a reputable journal doesn't mean we take it at face value. There might still be some concerns. And so we want to really read critically in order to determine whether or not this research seems valuable and trustworthy. Okay, so shifting focus a little bit, how can I organize these sources? I have all of these papers, all these monographs. How do I actually organize them? So my question to you is, well, how do you currently organize this research? How do you keep track of things? So feel free to contribute in the chat. Okay, so I'm seeing some reference to reference managers, sometimes known as citation managers, specifically Zotero. And these kind of platforms or technology, they didn't really exist when I was a student many years ago. And I wish they had because I just kept track of everything by hand. I still remember in my undergrad when I was writing my honors thesis, I had just like paper printouts all over my floor because I was looking for a quote that I knew I had in one of these papers, and I had to just manually go through all these papers to find this quote that I knew was present. So it's exhausting. The more references you actually have to try and keep track of things manually. So certainly using citation management software can be very valuable. I'm not an expert in this kind of software, but there are resources that are available through the library if you want to learn more about this, if you're not already using them. So the three most well-known ones are EndNote, Mendeley, and Zotero. And they have, I think most, if not all of them, can like be incorporated into Word to help you like automatically generate a reference list. So they're just some really nice, there's just really nice functionality attached to this software. So I encourage you to investigate them if you're not already familiar and decide whether or not to use them. Now, another way, sort of a complement to a reference manager, is to make use of an annotated bibliography or a matrix, or both. And the reason why you might incorporate one of these systems is because it's going to help you, yes, track where information is coming from, organize, but also comment. So often, as you are reading and gathering and reading your sources, you want to make sure that you're not losing the different insights that you're generating as you're reading these different sources. So having a formal note-keeping system that you can follow can be very useful for keeping track of where information is coming from and also protect against accidental plagiarism. Annotated bibliographies, you might have done these for courses in the past. They're a fairly popular assignment. And basically the premise is it's not just the citation information, and you're not just taking the abstract from the source and plunking it in as the citation or the annotation rather. Instead, you're using that space to put the information that's most valuable to you when you're going to use this information to write a literature review, for instance. So it's a way to capture some of the analysis that you're generating because you're asking all of these really pointed and targeted questions. And it's also a bit of a memory aid because if you're just copying and pasting an abstract, you're not engaging with that information. Whereas if you're actually writing the annotation, it's going to help secure some of that information in your memory while still having it as the sort of record that you can easily refer to. So you can ask like, hey, what are the takeaways I want to be mindful of? How do these sources relate to each other? So we're going to look at a sample annotation. The research context is looking at the effect of these like robo pets, specifically GestoCat, in terms of helping older adults with who are experiencing dementia. So are these types of robot companions useful in these situations? So here we have our annotation, and this is something that we've written after reading this article, Using a Robotic Cat in Dementia Care, a Pilot Study. So we've read that, and we've put together this annotation. And we're going to read through, and as we read through, my question to you is, well, what kind of information is present in this annotation? The authors study the impact of a robotic cat, GestoCat, on the mood and behavior of 4 persons living with dementia. The researchers used a mixed methods design that incorporated the Cohen-Mansfield Agitation Inventory and Quality of Life in Late-Stage Dementia Scale. Information gathered from these instruments was implemented with interviews with professional caregivers and relatives. The GestoCat intervention was shown to have some positive benefits, but the limitations of the small sample mean that results must be cautiously interpreted. The authors acknowledge this weakness and likewise discuss how uncontrolled variables, such as extra attention given to participants, may have biased the results. Despite the project's limitations, the researchers conclude that the GestoCat has merits as a therapeutic intervention and can be practically implemented due to its hygienic design and ease of use. Of concern is author affiliation with the company that produces GestoCat, as one author appears in a promotional video for the product, speaking to possible conflicts of interest. However, for the purposes of my own research, this article reinforces that more frequent monitoring is needed to better assess the impact of interventions within this population group, given that the often variable symptomology associated with dementia, which theoretically could be achieved through an AI and enhanced care bot. Okay, that's a lot of information. But with an annotation, you really provide as much or as little detail that you think is going to be useful for you and is going to help you keep track of what you are reading. So here we provide just a quick overview of the project and the methods. We look at the results and interpretation, and this sort of incorporates some of our perspective as well as the authors. So there was a lot of discussion around the small sample size. I mean, this is based on 4 people, right? That's a pretty small sample for almost any study. And then we have some critique. This is something that might have to be surfaced because of a possible conflict of interest, especially if it was not disclosed in the actual article. And then connections to one's own research. So what is going to be useful for you when putting together a research project, for instance? So if you're not putting together a research project, then that connections to own research might be less necessary. But again, it's really about trying to figure out what are the details that I want to retain so that when I'm actually writing up the literature review, I don't have to go back and read everything all over again. So when you're thinking about annotation, what did the authors do? How did they do it? What did they discover? How did they interpret the results? What observations or criticisms do I have? This is like that really big aspect of the annotation that is going to be the most valuable to you, perhaps. And what have I learned about this topic? But again, it's flexible. You could be more detailed. You could use all those questions that we were looking at earlier if you wanted to answer all of those questions and keep track that way. Might be a bit intense, but certainly you wouldn't lose track of any of that information. So you really want to make those annotations meaningful for you, thinking about, okay, what sources are likely going to feature in my literature review, which ones might get a bit of extra space in the literature review because of their importance proportionate to other studies. And I recognize this initially, it seems very time consuming, but it's one of those things where putting the time in at the start can help save some of the time later. So stations can make putting together the literature review a little bit more straightforward. All right, so now we're going to shift focus a bit and look at sort of writing styles. Now with writing, there's a lot of subjectivity in writing, and my philosophy is really focused on trying to determine our preferences and understanding preferences so that we can then apply some of those preferences in our own writing. So we have two texts or two bits of writing that are focused on the same content. And my question to you is, okay, which do you like better, sample 1 or sample 2? And feel free to provide a justification for your response. So the first sample reads as follows. Baptiste reviewed 85 instances of elderly women who experienced hip fractures following falls. He determined that in the majority of cases, these falls were preventable. Beyond the physiological impacts of these falls, the cost associated with such injuries was significant. Adams also studied instances of elderly women experiencing hip fractures in her study. According to her research, most of these falls were preventable. Meanwhile, in 2018, Statistics Canada released a report on the costs associated with bone fractures in elderly populations, which often result in expensive hospitalizations. These injuries are often caused by falls and are largely preventable. Sample 2. Bone fractures in elderly populations are commonly associated with falls, the majority of which are preventable. Moreover, these injuries are frequently responsible for costly hospital stays. So, do you have a preference for sample 1 or sample 2? So we're seeing a little bit of disagreement emerging. Some preference for sample 2, some preference for sample 1, or sort of seeing why someone might prefer one over the other. And again, so this is speaking to preferences. It's really trying to figure out, okay, what do you gravitate toward as a reader and why? And being very mindful of that so that you can think about that when it comes to your own writing. Now, depending on the context, sometimes you need more context. I'm repeating myself. But depending on the information that you think your reader needs, you're going to provide more or less information. It's always really dependent on how you are envisioning your reader's needs. However, if you are sort of presenting an overview of information and you don't need as much detail, you might gravitate toward that second sample because it's capturing sort of the shared highlights, shall we say. So we're losing a little bit of context. So we are giving something up, but what we're gaining is perhaps some improved readability. Now, it might be that you might be thinking, actually, I would like something in between these two. I would like something that is sort of hovering between sample 1 and sample 2. And I think that is also that's a valid response because we're just trying to gauge what we respond to as readers. So the reason I talk about synthesis, and I'll get into that I think a little bit more in part 2 as well, but I wanted to surface it here, is that one of the most common pitfalls in literature reviews is that you just have a series of summaries, sort of one after the other. So one paragraph is about one study, the next paragraph is about another study or another source, and so on and so on and so forth. And that is something that we really want to avoid in a literature review. So with synthesis, we start looking for these patterns. So here we have a little activity. And my question to you is, well, how might you organize these images? So let's take 2 or 3 minutes. How might you actually organize these different images? And feel free to provide a bit of explanation for it. Right, I'm just seeing that we're getting a bit close on time. So normally I'd give a few more minutes, but so we have animals versus non-animals, things that are sleeping but not sleeping, but where do we put that treasure chest? And so whenever I do this activity, it's always really interesting to see what people do with that treasure chest. I've had people construct narratives so that someone at the end wins the treasure chest. It's really, really interesting to see how people approach this. And there's really no right or wrong answer to an activity like this. We could say, okay, let's look at animals versus food, and maybe there's a bit of overlap with that cat trying to get the dinner plate, and we're just going to have to exclude the treasure chest altogether. Or we could approach it in a slightly different way. So we could have black and white animals, we could have cats, we could have food, and again, a little bit of overlap between the cat trying to get that dinner plate, but once again, we're excluding that treasure chest. Or we have ones that are asleep, We have ones that have food, and then we have two outliers. We have the treasure chest and like what the business cat. I'm not quite sure what the little outfit is meant to represent. So there are lots and lots of different ways that we can organize these images. And in a similar way, this is how we can think about how we organize our sources that we've found. Because as we research, we find all of these different sources, but once we start reading them, we start making decisions about whether or not they're actually going to feature in our literature review. So it might be that there was a study that the title itself seemed so relevant to what we were going to be writing about. And then after we've read the abstract, we know this is actually not going to, this doesn't have space for this literature review. Whereas, so once we've gone through that, almost like that process of exclusion, then we have sources that are going to relate in some way. And it's up to us to try and figure out where those patterns emerge. So this is where using a matrix can be really useful to start visualizing really quickly how those different sources relate. So if you've already done an annotated bibliography, a lot of this can almost be copied and pasted into the template, or this could be the way in which you're keeping track of your reading instead of an annotated bibliography. So here we might have a research question: what interventions reduce the likelihood of bone fractures among elderly populations? And we start plunking all this information into our matrix. We have studies that have a different research focus. We have some different methodologies emerging, and we're identifying some of the strengths and limitations of these studies. Now, because everything is sort of clustered together in this organized fashion, at a glance, we can start making some comparisons that are going to help us figure out where we might reference these studies in order in that linear literature review. So we have two studies, for instance, that are really focused on exercise, whereas we have some studies are focused that have a longitudinal perspective. And so we have some options now in terms of thinking how we're going to organize our literature review, because we might think, okay, maybe we're going to focus on organizing based on the research focus. So those two exercise-based studies, they're going to pair really, really nicely with each other, whereas the diet one, the stem cell injection one, those might come before or after those paired studies. So we start to see where these things relate to each other. And this is where things can get really fun in a nerdy way, where you start to think about, okay, how do these things fit? And so using a mind map can be really, really useful because it's going to help you see visually those different relationships and where those clusters start to emerge. So in the same way that we have those sleeping animals together, that can be one of those main themes when we're putting it together in a mind map. So our bone fractures study, and we have some themes emerging. Okay, we have bone density, we have interventions, we have costs, we have demographics. But we might start asking ourselves, before we've actually had to write anything down, this is a good moment to pause and figure out, wait a minute, is this the best organization that we have? Is there a way to reorganize this so it's going to make more sense when we approach writing this linear text? So we might decide, let's move some things around because we haven't invested that much time yet into our structure. So it's going to be easier to make some of these big structural changes now. And so we moved it around. We've reduced the number of big themes, but we've been more mindful of how those different sub-themes and sub-themes start to be expressed. So we're actually going to take the reference to the demographics and the costs, and we're actually going to put that into our introduction to help provide some context for why people should actually care about this topic of bone fractures in elderly populations to begin with. And then we're focusing on bone density, so the actual like what's happening to the bone that makes it more likely to fracture, and then proposed interventions for dealing with this injury in this population. So it starts to make a lot more sense, and it's going to be easier then to start figuring out how this is going to present itself in a linear organization, which is how we write or present our literature reviews. So we're able to take these topics, these subtopics, import them into an outline, and we're able to make use of our research matrix and start to populate, okay, what sources am I going to use for writing different sections? Literally starting to think about paragraphs at this point. And so we're clustering all of these related sources, and we're going to think about how densely or how detailed we want the writing to be to best capture that information for our readers. So there are two resources that might be of interest to you. If you are interested in using something like Excel to sort of create a research matrix as a sort of a note-keeping tool. And at the end, I'll try and grab these links and actually pop them into the chat. So the two are from Dr. Elaine Gregerson and Dr. Raul Pacheco Vega. So both good resources to investigate. So when we are thinking about synthesis and having these blended sources, it can actually be a very useful way to signal to our readers that we're very confident in managing the conversation. So we're able to see where things are clustering and make a determination about how much or how little detail is needed from individual sources. And we're doing all of this difficult work for our readers. And so having things a bit more blended, a bit more synthesized can often just create a nice first impression for our readers. We've sort of done the behind the scenes work because we've made all these decisions about how information is going to be organized. And we're also increasingly trying to develop our own style, foregrounding the importance of readability and making sure that our readers are pleased with the text that we're presenting to them. So we have 2 minutes left. How do all of these themes, these sub-themes relate to each other? Well, it really depends, because there's not going to be a perfect way to organize all of this information. You really want to try and figure out where are those patterns, where are those pairings, where are those sleeping animals that can be bundled into discrete paragraphs. It is this imaginative process because you're asking yourself, okay, does this make sense for my reader? What information do they need? Should they learn about this topic before I introduce this topic? And so it's a bit of back and forth, but I encourage you to play with outlines, figure out, okay, before I actually commit a lot to writing, maybe I should move some sections around. Recognize that even after that first draft, the structure might change. Even after the second or third draft, the actual structure still might change a little bit. So you don't have to have this perfect outline to start with, simply because things might change as you start writing. And seek out feedback, because you're writing for a reader. So the most useful thing to do is gain feedback from readers to make sure you're on the right track. Now, systems like using a research matrix or annotated bibliographies or citation managers, they only work if you are sticking with them. So if you find that certain things you're not really finding useful, you don't have to force yourself to organize yourself in one way over the other, as long as you have a system of organization that's useful and doesn't really stress you out. And you can also think about how you can use some of these different tools in complementary ways. So using a citation manager in addition to a matrix, for instance. So part 2, next week, we'll focus on some common structures of literature reviews and then some key writing techniques. But I am happy to stick around if there are any questions. Also put my email in the chat if folks want to reach out that way. So I'm more than happy to hear from students. If you have questions about this presentation or just some other writing questions that you think I might be able to help out with, feel free to get in touch. I typically am available to meet online, in person, or connect via email. So yeah, so that shouldn't be a barrier, basically.
Thank you so much, Jill, for such an informative and interactive event. And I can't wait to attend your part 2 on Thursday, June 8th. Thank you so much again for everyone for showing up to today's event. And I hope that all of you have a fantastic week.